This chapter is about the strength and power athletes, and we're looking at athletes that are doing events that are high burst intensity, short duration, typically under a minute and a half, and also those that are looking for ability to develop a strong or a quick amount of strength in a very quick amount of time, and that's our power athletes. The energy system is important to recognize when we look at each one of the nutritional needs of an athlete. So the energy system that's primarily utilized for our strength power athletes are going to be the phosphagen system, that's that immediate system that's there right now, and then also an anaerobic system, and that is the one that is started out within seconds, and it has the ability to generate energy without the use of oxygen. Now, when we look at those energy systems that are primarily of use during exercise, we can't overlook the recovery, and that is really what the aerobic energy system is going to be helpful for. The picture that was shown, oh goodness, I think this was in chapter 2. It also was looking at energy systems. I thought it was worth bringing and putting in the slide for now, because if we look at where the ATP is supplied, the red line is the phosphagen system. And we know that initially when exercise starts, we have that explosive capacity to generate energy due to the ATP-PC, or the phosphagen system. So that is really the reliance on that energy system for those explosive movements that last 0 to 30 seconds. So those are where a lot of our athletes are going to be in this chapter, in that portion 1. You'll see that the orange bar, where the orange line, is the anaerobic system, and that turns on right away, and it does participate in some energy, but it tends to be more of a contributor when you get to those near maximal efforts that last a little bit longer. And when you're in room or box or column number 2, you are still relying on your phosphagen, but it's very short duration that it can really contribute. It has to be regenerated. That system is only for short, quick times. And the anaerobic system starts to end up being taxed because it produces that lactate, which has to go somewhere. And the lactate becomes releases the hydrogen ion, it becomes lactic acid, and it ends up shutting down that, or turning off that ability to do that high intensity near maximal efforts. And that is going to be in column 2. You'll see that the aerobic component, or the blue line, is the predominant source of energy for the moderate or longer duration activity systems activities, and that's 3 and 4. So the explosive movements would be like a hammer throw, a javelin, a shot put. I always think of like when a goalkeeper blocks something and jumps and runs and blocks at a soccer game, discus, wrestling, but I can also say that wrestling can also be a near maximal. Sprinting, high jump, long jump, those are right in between 1 and 2. So how do you determine the caloric needs of a power athlete? Well, you do the same thing that you did with every other athlete. You look at the age, the sex, the size, and the energy demand of the sport. But the main goal is to make sure that you get sufficient calories. And you've seen this equation several times. Now it's labeled as table 13.1, but it was also in table 12. And it was also way back, I think, in chapter 2 or 3. We can estimate our caloric needs based upon sex, age, and then we're looking at that activity factor. So this resting energy expenditure is that non-fasted baseline energy. Then we add, we take in consideration the individual's body weight in kgs, and then we have this wiggle room of activity factor, which would perhaps account for off days or high intensity days at the upper end. And it gives us an idea of whether or not somebody wants, or maybe if somebody's on the weight loss, trying to thin down, that activity factor gives us a nice range. And for strength athletes, we're looking at most of the calories being consumed before or after training sessions, not so much during the training sessions. Now, we can use these equations, and you've used them when you calculated the number of calories in that dietary analysis. It's basically the same thing, where you enter the same amount of the same information. There is an example in the textbook. There's a couple of them. And you have an 11-year-old gymnast who weighs 95 pounds. When we look at the estimation of what their caloric needs are and put it in that equation utilizing the age-appropriate calculation, and then looking at the resting energy expenditure of about 1,275 kcals, we have a range between 2,000 and 3,000 kcals, roughly. And again, we don't do decimal points in kcals, we just do whole kcals. Likewise, we want to have, we don't want to use a 0.5 in our REE. So this is what was shown as what this individual was eating, and if we look all the way down, we'll see that this individual's caloric intake was 916, which is about half what the recommended value was. And this happens a lot in figure skating, gymnasts, ballet, those sports where small body, aesthetic look, you know, someone's going to be tossed in the air or have to be really light to be able to jump for impact. That's not uncommon. We look at the calculated caloric intake, and she's consuming about 67% of her calories of carbohydrate. And so we look at that and we go like, oh, that's okay. But, you know, it's a little high in the carbohydrate, number one. The recommended daily amount minimum is 130 grams of carbohydrate. That's the crazy, crazy value that you'll see, because that's what's really needed for brain function. So she's meeting that just fine, but she's eating very little, a lot of fat-free, and primarily carbohydrate. And this is an athlete that's got to have strength, power, muscle strength is going to be important. Ability to generate strength quickly or power is going to be important for this individual as well. Now here's what the meal plan looks like after the recommendation, and this has approximately 2,072 calories and 290 grams of carbohydrate. So it's still going to be a good percentage, but we're looking at, instead of just a plain bagel, adding a little protein, a little carbohydrate. We look at adding some variety into her salad and adding a small turkey sandwich, a little bit of calcium, and that's really another problem that we run into with these athletes. The same amount of chicken, potato, but here we're adding just a little bit of oil, a little bit of some protein, and also some hydration and calcium in that milk. And so we're looking at that change of bringing her up on a non-training day. Now, however, the issue that you have is you can't go right from 916 calories to 2,072. You have to make small changes very gradually, and you want to catch these things pretty early and make, because you don't want your athlete to get into a mental state, which is an eating disorder, is a psychological disorder. It is not a nutritional disorder. It's demonstrated by a nutritional disorder, but it is a psychological disorder. And we want to make sure that we're training our athletes to eat well, to get most of their nutrition via food if they can, and to have a good breakdown in terms of our carbohydrates, proteins, and fat. So the carbohydrate needs are based upon what we use with energy is primarily, remember, the aerobic system. The use of carbohydrates is going to be important for recovery. We can use a daily intake of 6 to 10 grams per kg for most athletes, and with that, it should secondarily calculate what does this mean in terms of percent total calories. We want to make sure that we're getting sufficient carbohydrates simply because it is the master fuel. We're not using protein or fat during activity. We utilize that carbohydrate store potentially if we're doing repetitive high intensity exercise. And so we want to make sure that our athlete is getting sufficient carbohydrates. And this is equivalent to, back in the carbohydrate chapter, the high volume training value, 6 to 10 grams per kg. And it is helpful to have some carbohydrate and protein before and after training. It tends to be helpful for not so much the energy during exercise, but for making the recovery more effective for building protein, muscle. So the recovery is 1 to 1.2 grams per kg for about 4 hours post-exercise. So this has not changed. This recommendation has not changed. There is some tweaking for our power athletes, and but it's not really, I mean, the baseline is the carbohydrate need is the carbohydrate need. The daily protein recommendations are also from the protein chapter. And here we have athletes in special circumstances. So here's our value. Now it's slightly different. The author moves to 1.4 to 2.0 based upon some research. However, we're looking at approximately the same value that was discussed in chapter 5. And when somebody is in heavy training, perhaps they need 2.0, or if they're in weight loss. Remember, I'd mentioned that if you're not getting sufficient calories, your protein needs increase. So we're looking at approximately no more than 2, unless there are special circumstances. But then we always look back and say, well, how does this fit with our total percentage of calories from each nutrient? And so that's going to be a good spot to double check. The protein needs for our strength athlete is going to be important because the micro tears are going to be the basis of adaptation or increase in muscle protein, increase in strength. So that micro damage and ultimately the training adaptations need to have sufficient protein. But I'm going to remind you that excessive amounts are not recommended. It is going to increase your hydration needs, and you'll see strength and power athletes carry around gallon jugs of water around, and that's totally fine. That's totally fine. But if you have this excessively high protein consumption, it is going to, it's not identified as being helpful, but it is going to increase your fluid needs. We want to make sure we're getting complete, or if you are eating a vegetarian diet, some complementary protein sources, and it doesn't have to be in the same meal, but it needs to be in the same day. And if protein supplements are needed, and this is especially for those individuals that are having tremendous training, high frequency, high duration, high intensity training, that may not be able to get sufficient calories, that those protein supplements can be helpful, but you can add them to a milk or chocolate milk and be getting your needs, your hydration and your protein needs in that way as well. So we're looking at, again, somewhere between 15 to 35% of total calories, but when somebody is in intensive training or injury or in weight loss, we're looking at 25 to 35% of total calories, and that's really where we're going. That's the base. The work of looking at amino acids and essential amino acids are it's really difficult. They're pretty expensive. They're not really found to be exceptionally significantly better, and so getting some good protein and carbohydrate in almost a 2-to-1 ratio, carbohydrate to protein 2-to-1 ratio after training is really effective.